And so these other pieces I've written about particle physics are doing a similar thing where I can take this concept and then explore it musically and present it in a way that certainly a scientific paper would lose most of its readers if they're not scientists.
Right.
And maybe a diagram would lose fewer people, but still it might not make sense to everyone. But those of people who hear music and are able to, feel it in a similar way that I do, they'd understand completely my understanding of like quantum field theory as a newer example. I wrote a piano piece about that. And, it was fun to explore that theory, but then to take that idea and say, what does music sound like if it tries to show what that theory is saying to everyone? And it turned into a piece of music that I never thought I would write stylistically, because it's so different, because the style needed to be different to explain this really strange concept of what we think, how the universe works.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. Howdy, y'all, and welcome to another edition of the podcast. If you are new here, it's great to have you along, and just to let you know what you're getting yourself into, my name is Tyler. I'm a composer, a radio broadcaster, curator, producer, do a lot of things, and that list continues to grow, it feels like. But mostly, I would simply say that I am a maker. I really love to just make things. And on this podcast, I sit down with other creative people to discuss their journey, process, philosophies, basically whatever it is that makes them who they are and inspires them to also make what they make. And if this is not your first time here, just want to say welcome back. On this episode of Music Maker, I'm joined by Roger Zare. Roger Zare has been praised for his enviable grasp of orchestration by the New York Times and for writing music with formal clarity and an alluringly mercurial surface. He was born in Sarasota, Florida, and has written for a wide variety of ensembles from solo instruments to full orchestra. Often inspired by science, mathematics, literature, and mythology, his colorfully descriptive and energetic works have been performed on 6 continents by a myriad of amazing ensembles. Y'all, I just have to let you know, this conversation totally turns into a deep dive into all sorts of scientific topics, but no need to worry. You'll quickly realize that Roger speaks about all these things in such a down-to-earth way, and I mean, that's really sort of the point. A lot of Roger's work involves connecting complex sciences with not just musical audiences, but also even young musicians in some cases. Anyway, it is a fantastic chat. And of course, we talk about Roger's roots growing up in Sarasota and how his first experience as a composer was at a very young age, and how his focus on large ensemble writing has shaped his pathway as a composer. A little bit of business to share before we jump into this conversation. One of the simplest and indeed the best way for you to support this podcast is to just keep doing what you're doing now, listening. Listen to this episode, listening to earlier episodes, tell all your friends, spread the word with folks who might be interested in listening themselves, and then give us a follow on the podcast app that you're streaming from right now. That'll ensure that the newest episode is pushed to your device as soon as it's released. Also, an equally impactful way to help the Music Maker podcast is to leave a rating and a review if you're able to and if you feel inclined. We've gotten a couple of those reviews so far, and it's been so great to read your thoughts here on the podcast, but they are fleeting. There's not that many of them, and I'd love to read more. So if you can share those with me, you can do so on Apple Podcasts. That's where you can leave a review. Or now on Spotify, you can actually leave comments on each individual episode, or if you just want to write me an email, you can find information on how to do that over on the Loose Leaf Transmissions website. So ratings, reviews, comments, the more of those that we have, the more visibility the podcast has, and the more that we can grow as a podcast and a network. Now, on to my conversation with Roger Zare. Well, Roger, it's so great to sit down with you again. I think it was not that long ago I had you on my radio show as a guest to talk about some very specific events in Sarasota. And we talked a little bit about your background in that conversation, but nothing really too in depth. So I'm glad to be able to spend some time with you today to get to know your journey a little more, talk about your process a little more, your philosophies. And so, yeah, just thanks so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
So, where we like to begin is as far back as you remember or care to share, and that is, what is your earliest artistic memory as a composer?
So I remember how I got into music was my parents both played piano. There was a piano in the house, and they both played when they were young, and they would play some of the music that they remembered from their youth. And little 4-year-old me wanted to imitate them. Of course, I couldn't play any of the complicated Chopin pieces that they were playing, but I remember improvising around a little bit, and they thought that it wasn't so random. They thought I was actually trying to do things, and so they decided I was showing some kind of aptitude towards music and started me on piano lessons. And not long after that, I tried my hand at composing for the first time. I wrote a couple short piano pieces. I didn't really know much about music yet. I just started learning about it. I just started reading music. And so this was very young me also trying to notate things. And it didn't really stick at that time. I found it was frustrating, not because of the creative process, but because of the handwriting. I was a
Uh,
5-year-old boy and I didn't want to draw straight lines. And so it was such a pain to notate things and make it look legible. Otherwise, who could possibly read it afterwards? So I didn't stick with it at that time. And of course, I didn't know that much about music. And over the next number of years, I was really lucky to get to go see a lot of concerts. My dad would always be playing music in the car. We'd have the radio on at WSMR. Before it was even WSMR, it was WSF that had all of the classical music in the area at that time. And I remember learning a lot about that. I remember going to concerts as a kid, and for like a chamber concert, we get the seats behind where the piano was in the balcony, and we'd bring binoculars, and I would read the music from over the shoulder of the pianist for the whole concert. And I love doing that. I think I got more and more connected to music and notation through that time. It wasn't until much later that I actually tried composing using notation software, and that's when I absolutely loved it, and it stuck. And I continued being a composer after that point.
yeah, I guess notation software is a little more clear than like 5-year-old use handwriting, right?
Yeah, yeah, it was just such a pain to make a single straight line, let
Right.
alone the hundreds you have to make for any kind of composition.
To be fair, I still feel that way sometimes when I'm writing by hand, but I digress. I mean, it sounds like you had a childhood that was steeped in classical music. Is that primarily what, I guess, for lack of a better word, is that what you consumed as a young boy, or did you have other types of music in your orbit as well?
That was most of the music that I was paying attention to. So it was interesting. I didn't get I mean, I was exposed to some of the popular music of the day, and this was like late 80s, early 90s. And I remember one of my older brothers loved Genesis, and he loved playing classic rock. And so I'd hear a lot of it when he would play it, and I got to know some of those songs, but it wasn't the main thing that I sought out to listen to myself. I was really listening to a lot of classical music that my dad would play. That's his favorite kind of music to listen to. So every time in the car with WSF, or he had a radio player with a CD player in it in the house. And so he'd put on this collection of CDs that he had. And I remember some of them stood out to me. I loved the recording of the planets. Like that
Mm,
was such a colorful piece, and I had no idea about any of that. I just loved hearing it as a little kid growing up, as well as so many other things from mostly classical romantic era music, some Baroque music. But that was generally what I consumed when I was growing up. And of course, playing piano, most of the music I was playing also was along that line. Then I picked up violin when I was in middle school. And so, you know, being able to participate in orchestra now, most of the music that I was playing was also along that line. So I got very used to just looking for classical music to listen to.
yeah, that's awesome. I mean, it's so funny that you bring up the planets because that was like neither of my parents are classical musicians or musicians at all for that matter. So a lot of my entry points were through like school band and that sort of thing. So I discovered the planets through marching band actually, like hearing a marching band, like a high school marching band play it or something.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah, and I was like, "Oh, I want to hear more of this." And so that was one of my first CDs I ever kind of consciously bought as like a youngster was the planets, I think, with maybe like the Berlin Philharmonic.
Mhm.
And yeah, that was just like anytime anyone's like, what's like the first piece of music you remember falling in love with? I think it's the planets. And I mean, it's such an evocative work. I mean, it's really easy to understand, so anyway, I kind of feel you on that one. So you've alluded a little bit to our how we both have connections to Sarasota. I've been employed with WSMR, the classical station there, since I was in grad school. So that's 2013. And so I'm curious to know more about the creative foundation Sarasota provided you, because today, I mean, still today, and I'm sure it's been this way for quite some time, it's just such a culturally and artistically rich community. And I think that kind of goes against what maybe a lot of people who don't live in Florida or don't live in that part of Florida, they might not think of a place like that existing in Florida. So can you talk about like your foundation that you received in Sarasota? What kinds of opportunities did you have as a young musician, and how did that kind of spark your desire to just keep going with it?
Sarasota is a great place for the arts, and I really appreciated that growing up. So as a kid, Sarasota, the population of Sarasota has quite a few retirees and not that many young people. At least back when I was growing up there, that was basically what it felt like. And because of that, maybe we made jokes that the nightlife wasn't really great for kids. There weren't
Yeah,
many things to do at night besides go to the movie theater. But there were a lot of classical concerts. There was a lot of support for the arts because what do retirees bring? They bring their love for the arts, and they want to make sure that they're able to experience that when they're living there. So we've got a world-class symphony in the Sarasota Orchestra. I remember when it was the Florida West Coast Symphony back in the day, like over 20 years ago, before they changed their name. And along with the Sarasota Orchestra, there was a youth orchestra program. And so once I started playing violin, I joined that. And that just gave me so many more opportunities to make music with friends. Before that, I was a pianist. And pianists tend to play by themselves most of the time. Certainly, I was, getting used to just practicing on my own. It wasn't my favorite thing to do. But playing violin, now I got to play in an orchestra. The school that I went to had a really great orchestra program. It was Pineview School, so I made a lot of friends through that. I also made a lot of music through that. And the youth orchestra program was excellent. I got chances to play concertos now and play in a full orchestra for the first time. I remember that experience like it was yesterday because it was so exciting to go from you're playing an instrument that sounds like everyone else's instrument, and now you're in a room where you are one of many different colors and many different ways of producing sound, and just the amount of variety that music could have exploded in that. It was so exciting for me. And I also got my start composing through just meeting people through orchestra, first through high school and also through the youth orchestra program. I also played piano all the way through since I was 5, all the way through college. I continued taking lessons and had many opportunities to perform around Sarasota. So it's a very rich place for the arts. Not only is the symphony great, there's also a great opera program. There's a great ballet there as well that's really fantastic. And I got to experience a lot of these things growing up. Along with the orchestra, there's the Sarasota Music Festival that every June for 3 weeks, some of the best musicians from everywhere around the world descend upon Sarasota and make great music. And it's a student-based festival. So the faculty come in, and then all these really amazing students from all the conservatories and universities and everywhere, mostly around the United States, but also some people come internationally. And the quality is just incredible. I remember getting to see those every summer for those 3 weeks. And it's when school is finishing. So I was able to go to a lot of concerts at the festival. They also opened up master classes and rehearsals. So I was able to attend a lot of those and just learn so much about music and hear such a huge variety of music as well. And so that was instrumental in developing my knowledge of music and my musicianship to be able to experience that every summer, right in my backyard. I ended up working at that festival years later through high school because it's June in Sarasota. It's rather warm, and so they
right.
give all the students free ice cream. And I got to be the ice cream scooper for a couple of summers. That was a lot of fun, but also it meant I could be right next to all those rehearsals and master classes and concerts. And I also worked some administrative positions at that festival. But what I ended up doing was every June, after I was an undergrad already studying composition, I realized how they choose repertoire is the students get to pick what they want to play after the first week. And so I would start asking them, hey, I've got this wind quintet or the string quartet or the string trio. Would you be interested in signing up to learn it next week and maybe perform it? And I got a few people to say yes.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then it was coached by one of the faculty members. And then quite often it would end up being programmed on one of the many concerts. They have, I don't know how many hours of music every week from those student groups. But I got a number of premieres at the festival by these amazing musicians. And that was such a great opportunity to extend what I was doing as a composer from my undergrad studies to the real world.
Right, right. I mean, as long as I've been paying attention to specifically the Sarasota Orchestra and Sarasota Music Festival, like what you're talking about, they've been so great about championing new works, the music of living composers. And I mean, was that always the case, like when you were growing up? And I guess I'm going to wrap my next question into this and maybe frame it in this way. But were you able to interact with composers at the festival? When was the first time you encountered a composer in real life?
Yeah, it was at the music festival,
Yeah,
Sarasota Music
nice.
Festival. So the amount of new music that you'd hear in Sarasota actually not has not always been that much. Now, a while back, like New Music New College existed, and I got to experience some really cool things that they were putting on. Like they had Stockhausen's Stimmung that they were rehearsing and performing, and they spent like 30 some hours of rehearsal to put that together, and that's just unheard of for most ensembles, unless it's a college ensemble that's dedicated to new music like that. And that was amazing to see. But I remember there was a new music concert one year, and it like Schoenberg was on that program
Right.
because the tastes in Sarasota had often been very conservative. A lot of times there wasn't a new piece on the orchestra programs. I think with changes of conductors and leadership and all of that, and a lot of different musicians coming in, that attitude has changed. And there's so much more new music being put on programs these days, which is really wonderful. But it does mean that the handful of newer pieces that I heard really stood out to me, especially once I'd started composing. And I just started composing, I was around ninth to 10th grade age. And at the music festival, I met Lucas Foss, wonderful American composer, and he was commissioned by Carol Winsense, who was on the faculty for a flute concerto. And so it's Renaissance Concerto is the name of that piece, and she was performing it, and they brought Lucas down to be a guest. And I remember meeting him. I didn't interact with him that much. I just started composing, but I remember that was really cool to see a living composer who had dedicated so much to composing. Because at that point, I was already feeling like this is definitely what I want to do. I love playing music, but now that I've started composing, I've got just such a bigger connection to it, and I feel like there's a bigger possibility for what I can do as an artist. And that was really intriguing. So I got to meet Lucas Foss there, and that was incredible. That was the first time that I met a living composer. I also remember getting to meet Jennifer Higdon,
Mm.
who came and did a program. The National Youth Orchestra Festival was hosted in Sarasota a couple of years, and there was a program that she did for young composers that was attached to one of those. And I basically just crashed it. I just showed up and audited. I don't know if I was supposed to, but I learned a lot from that because I met these composers who were, a handful of years older than me, but really accomplished, and I got to see what they were doing. And then I got to meet Jennifer Higdon, and she is amazing because she remembers everything. So I saw her again years and years later, and she remembered meeting me then and who I was. I gave her one of my pieces that I just been writing, and she remembered all of that. So that was incredible.
Oh, that's awesome. So I'm just trying to like kind of connect the dots, so to speak. So you mentioned that you were composing as a very young child, but didn't really get anywhere with that, and then you returned to it later when you got like a copy of some notation software. Did getting the notation software coincide with all these experiences you began having at the Sarasota Music Festival, or were you composing a little bit before that, and then you finally saw like, oh, I can actually like do this as a thing?
Between those two piano pieces I wrote when I was 6 or 5 or 6 or so, and when I got notation software when I was 13, I didn't write a single note. I didn't pursue composition when I didn't have a tool that I felt like I was comfortable using. But when I found it was a program called Noteworthy Composer, and I remember some
Yeah.
people at my high school had found it and told me about it, and it was like circulating around. So a few of my friends and I got copies of it. It's like very basic notation software. It was like $30, so it was affordable, and it was before I don't even know if Sibelius existed at this point. I know Finale was around, but some of the other software existed that I had never heard of. But Noteworthy Composer let me put notes in, and I got to hear them back, and I got to choose what instrument it would try to make it sound like. And that was really eye-opening to get to not just write for the instrument I could play, but to imagine writing for other instruments as well, and kind of get some feedback from the software saying this is what it might sound like. Now MIDI play back then was pretty terrible, but it was still it brought me into it, and that really got me going. My first composition that I ended up writing, I mean, my friends and I we should have been working on history papers or studying or whatever, but we were writing little bits of notation and sending it back and forth late at night. This was back in the days of AOL Instant Messenger. And so we were sending these noteworthy composer files back and forth. And one of my friends who played in the orchestra sent me a few musical ideas for string orchestra, and I kind of liked them. And so I just had the idea maybe if I expand upon them a little bit and see where they went. And, we went back and forth a little bit, and we ended up having a 10-minute piece for string orchestra that we both created collaboratively over the course of a few months. And we showed our orchestra teacher, and he saw that, it worked basically. And he did the best thing he could for me, is that he said, well, why don't you print out some parts and let's put it in front of the orchestra and I'll perform it. And so I remember it was played by an orchestra that I wasn't playing in. So I really got to sit back and take it in and listen
Nice.
to it. And that moment when I was sitting in the audience and it was being premiered, I just knew music is powerful, and I feel like I can use it as a new language. That I was gathering all these tools about how to use this language from listening to lots of music, and now suddenly I was able to speak with that language, and that was really powerful. And I knew from that day on I wanted to keep on trying to speak this music language and be a composer.
That's such an important story that you just described, because that was my experience too. I just happened to have a high school band director who was like so supportive of like, oh, you want to put some music in front of other people? Yeah, let's do it. Let's see what happens. And I think we even played a piece of mine at like a graduation ceremony one year. Not my graduation, obviously, but I often think about like, well, what if I had had a teacher who did not do that, who was not as supportive. I mean, I can only imagine how different my life would have been, and
Right.
so you mentioned the importance of this and how like it kind of solidified in your mind, like, okay, I want to keep doing this. I want to keep doing this for as long as possible. Would you say those early moments when you were having music played in your high school group, is that when you realized you wanted to pursue this craft as a career, or did like that decision come much later for whatever reason?
It wasn't that much later because I was starting to think about, okay, what am I going to go do in college? And anytime before that, the answer would be I'd be a piano performance major. I was quite adept at the piano, and I even had like an hour-long piano recital I gave as a senior in high school. I definitely could have pursued that and been perfectly happy had I enjoyed practicing more. But now that I had this composition thing that I was even more inclined to do, I was starting to think, well, how do I make a career out of that maybe instead? Is it possible? Because I wasn't having people telling me, okay, here's how you make, here's how you get commissions, which pay you money, and here's how you do this or that, and here's how royalties work, which supplements your income, and all of those things. I mean, most high school students don't really get the business side of something so specific as a music composition career. So I looked and looked around and see who are the composers who seem to be making a great living. And you think film scores are really prominent. John Williams is doing quite well from writing music, and his music also was doing things that I wanted music to do. I wanted it to describe things and make you feel things, and the stuff that music does at this really amazing level that's hard to describe sometimes. I was thinking, well, maybe I could pursue film scoring, and that would be a good career to have, and let me keep on composing and just enjoy the rest of my music career. And so that helped me shape like where I was looking at undergrad programs. University of Southern California came up, and this was also partly because I was meeting people from USC at the Sarasota Music Festival and asking
Yeah.
people about what colleges they go to and what are the opportunities. And I mean, USC, it's right next to Hollywood. It's got a super famous film school, which is actually physically right next to the music school. It's really great. And I thought it would be something that I'd enjoy doing as a composer. And so I decided to go to USC. I managed to, work my way towards going there. And the way that the program was working, so it was unusual. It was the one place that had a 4-year program that included composition and a film scoring certificate. Most places, the film scoring certificate would be a separate program. And currently it is that way because it was actually too much. The way it was structured. I know some people who did that. My year was actually the last one, I think, where they allowed you to do both within 4 years. And it was insanity for those who did. By that point, I had actually decided not to pursue that anymore. But it was a normal composition 4-year degree. Plus, you did the film scoring thing as much as you could during
Oh,
the fourth
yeah.
year. So that's just
Jeez.
like a little too much of
Right.
there's not enough time during that last year to really do both. But it was great. I got to work with some students who were in the film school who were directors and try out film scoring. I got really lucky to work with someone who wanted to write movies about musicians. And I realized after I did these that this is not the normal experience. Most of the time, you're not writing music that's being performed on screen, and all the characters are musicians dealing with music things.
Right. Right.
This was just this one director that I met who really enjoyed that. Most of the time, film scorers are writing music that serves something else that isn't necessarily a musical driven plot. So I also experienced a little of that, and it wasn't as enjoyable as I wanted it to be. I think at that point I was realizing like what more could I do when I wanted to write music for myself and for the things that I wanted to write about. And I didn't really want to be told, okay, this needs to be this long and this mood and use this style and all of those things. I'd rather just write the music the way I wanted it to. And the story you hear about John Williams writing, it's the chase scene in E.T., where Spielberg wanted to cut it down to a different length. And Williams said, I can't musically, I can't mess with it anymore. And then Spielberg recut the scene to fit the music. That doesn't normally happen. It's the other way around. And so I got to see a little bit about what the industry was like. So I'm glad that I wasn't like doing film scoring as from day one there. I was getting a true composition degree from day one. And then I was able to choose in my fourth year whether to do the film scoring or not. And I chose not to at that point. I wanted to stick with concert music.
Okay, so yeah, I was going to ask you, like, what made you decide to not pursue the film score thing? But 3 of the 4 years of your undergrad, you got to see all this stuff, and then you're like, nope, that's not what
Yeah,
I
yeah.
want to do.
I
Yeah,
was enjoying too much writing other music that could do whatever I wanted it to, and also exploring these things. So I went from living in Sarasota to living in LA, and Sarasota has great opportunities for the arts, but you can't compare that to LA, where
right.
you've got the LA Phil, you've got all the series that they put out, including the Green Umbrella series, where they had such amazing new music throughout the year. There were other places. I remember going to Red Cat Theater a few times, and I saw the RTD String Quartet. I saw all these amazing performances of such a huge variety of new music, and it just opened my mind to what was possible to do with music. A lot of which, maybe if you're lucky, you'll be able to write that for a film score one day. But I wanted to write that now and not like have to work through. I mean, also, in order to be John Williams, usually you have to be an orchestrator for many years and, keep on doing indie films on the side and like work your way up through the ranks. And I wanted to just express what I felt growing inside of me right away. So I could do that with concert music. Film music felt like it would channel me through a path that I didn't want to take.
I mean, you've made it pretty clear, like, why not do film music at that point in your life. But
Mhm.
was there a moment regarding like, just contemporary concert music that you experienced that made you want to double down on that?
Yeah, I think I started to get opportunities while I was an undergrad, especially for large ensemble. And so
Mm,
that's something that's just harder to come by as a composer. It's much easier to pull together a few friends and play a chamber piece
right.
or write a piece for yourself to play on whatever instrument you play. But to get an orchestra to play your music, that you need to have an orchestra that's able to take the time, and it's not a guarantee. So I was really lucky to have some opportunities for that. When I was in high school, so rewinding a little bit, I remember my first compositions were for string orchestra. So I'm already writing for lots of people. And I remember seeing that National Youth Orchestra Festival. And something that was really great growing up with the Sarasota Orchestra is that they had this thing called Concert Club. I don't think it exists anymore, but for K to 12 students, they would give you $2 concert tickets for any concert you wanted to go to. And so it was really affordable for me to go to as many concerts as I wanted. And I saw so many concerts. And I remember they were renovating the hall for a couple of years. And so they decided, well, let's not have the orchestra concerts because it's going to be in a smaller hall. So we can't be giving away too many of those. So I saw lots of chamber music during those 2 years. And I didn't hear a lot of orchestral music in the room. I certainly plenty of recordings, but I remember National Youth Orchestra Festival basically opened that new hall, that Van Wezel Hall, after its renovation was completed. And I remember sitting there at those concerts, just being so blown away by the sound of a full orchestra again. I didn't realize how much I had missed it the last couple of years. And also at this point, I had started composing, and I remember hearing Stravinsky's Firebird performed, and just like one thing after another was this amazing texture and this amazing color. It's amazing use of the orchestra. That's another piece I go back to many times and just think, like, this is incredible. Everything that Stravinsky does, every different move he makes, is just serves the music so well. And that weekend after I heard that performance, I wrote my first full orchestra piece in about 4 days. It was like 10 minutes of music in 4 days. It was crazy creativity that came out of me from that experience. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know the ranges of most of the instruments. And so when I showed that to my orchestra teacher, he said, well, the horns might explode if they try to play that, but otherwise it may work. And so he helped me fix some of those things, like get things within the range, first of all. And I didn't know the techniques of all the instruments, but he had the Youth Symphony read that piece. And so I got to actually hear what it sounded like. And it was amazing. It was not a great piece. Now that I look back on it, it was way overscored. I didn't know what I was doing. I hadn't taken orchestration class or even studied that many orchestra scores. But I already was developing these ideas of, what can I do with all of these different sounds at the same time? And that's really what I love to do most when I compose. Often when I write chamber music, it comes out as like a little orchestra piece where it tries to be bigger than the sum of its parts. And I'm really appreciative that I get opportunities to write for orchestra and wind ensemble quite often these days, because I feel like there's so many possibilities and it's so exciting to try to find new ones.
Well, so like nowadays, and I'm like jumping ahead of some of my questions a little bit here, but like
Sure.
nowadays, what percentage would you say you're writing large ensemble pieces versus chamber ensemble or solo, or for smaller forces?
I haven't done the math, but probably about 50-50.
Okay, yeah,
And partly because the wind ensemble world loves new music and keeps on asking
right.
me to write new pieces. And I know if I just write a brand new wind ensemble piece out of the blue and send it to some friends, they'll play it. If I do that with an orchestra piece, I might not get as many plays from that. So quite often creating new large ensemble music, because I have those opportunities to hear it, especially when ensemble music. I transcribe a lot of chamber music as well. And I have like a list of pieces that I'm planning on doing that when I have the time. 'Cause I think it gives pieces a second life
Of
that,
course, yeah.
it doesn't just have to be this one setting where you hear it. It could be 5 or 6 different settings where if it works musically, then you might as well give it that opportunity.
And it's just like a really intelligent, efficient way to go about that, I think. So,
Yeah. And it helps you do things with creativity that have the less pressure than creating something that's brand new when you're orchestrating something that already exists. So I like that it helps you succeed a little bit more easily at something.
yeah, of course. So can you walk us through, okay, so kind of jumping back, you're graduating from USC in Los Angeles, and can you walk us through like what your creative journey has looked like since that point? Do you feel like you basically followed a more conventional path as a composer, or were there any kind of unexpected twists that you feel have kind of defined your career?
Yeah, let's see. Well, so at USC, I got the opportunities to work with orchestras in a few different situations, and I feel like that has really helped launch me. Going back to your question about why I chose to pursue concert music instead of film scoring, I think it's because I started to get these opportunities to work with orchestras, and they're just such great opportunities and so much fun. I got a commission from the American Composers Orchestra. A few years later, I got New York Youth Symphony commission while I was an undergrad. And so those opportunities to work with such amazing orchestras in New York, I think encouraged me to stick with that and to really, figure out where could I go with that. So after I finished at USC, I wanted to keep on writing large ensemble music. I went to Peabody Conservatory and I got to study with Chris Theofanidis in his last year that he was teaching at Peabody. And that was really fantastic. I mean, he's got such great colors that he's able to work into a large ensemble piece. His rainbow body really stood out to me when I heard that the textures are incredible. So I got to work with him and keep on exploring that everywhere that I chose to study, Peabody and then University of Michigan in Ann Arbor after that. I chose because of the large ensemble opportunities, because I would get to at least have a reading, if not performances, with the orchestra or the bands there. And so I really tried to pursue that a lot. But I also was thinking, well, what's the best way for me to have a career where I'm not worrying about the next commission that I get? Because I know some years maybe I don't get a commission, and then what do I do? And so, pretty traditional path, getting a doctorate and going and trying to teach composition and theory at a university. That was my goal. And so I just went through, got my master's and got my doctorate in a row. We were talking before, I didn't take any time off in between degrees. I can't necessarily recommend that to everyone because it was exhausting, but I didn't know if I would want to go back to do another degree if I did take some time off. So
Yeah.
I just went full speed ahead. So after Michigan, I really just continued to pursue that. I looked for large ensemble opportunities, and once I was out of school, I was kind of looking for every opportunity as well. I feel like I've grown a lot as a chamber composer and as a composer of solo music since then. I've been forced to just confront those things that were difficult. Like I remember, I wrote plenty of chamber music when I was an undergrad, but it never felt like it was really a chamber piece. It felt like I was trying to write an orchestra piece for 3 people or 4 people too often. And sometimes that works, and usually it doesn't. Sometimes it just makes it not clear what the piece is supposed to be. So I feel like I've, through more experience, have been able to figure out what to do with all sorts of ensembles. I think the one area that I feel least comfortable with is writing for voice. As an instrumentalist myself and not a singer, like I can sing some things fine, but it's not really what I've done with my music. I don't know if my voice connects to singers and singing music as well. So that's been the one path that I haven't really pursued as much, but I think it's been pretty traditional. I've done a lot of festivals and residencies over that time, but it took me 5 years after getting my doctorate before I got my first college job. In the meantime, before that, I was trying to freelance, and I was continuing to get opportunities. But something that I did that was good. So you need to support yourself somehow. Knowing that I wanted to be a teacher, but not having a certification because I never
Yeah.
got an education degree, I found substitute teaching was the perfect thing that kept me in classrooms, but also gave me the flexibility to go do that residency or to take a couple weeks off if I needed to write a piece for a deadline. And once music teachers find out that there's a sub in the building that knows music, then you will get great musical opportunities in those classrooms. And so that was a lot of fun to get to, conduct rehearsals on days when they couldn't be there instead of just put on a movie or hand out a worksheet.
So you were like more or less singularly focused on like large ensemble, and that's kind of what helped you stepping stone to stepping stone move yourself forward.
Yeah. For quite a while, I remember a lot of the competitions that I won. It was all for my large ensemble music and never for a chamber piece or a solo piece for a very long time. So I feel like that defines. I think it connects to what I want my music to be. I want there to be this variety of colors, this variety of sound and shapes and gestures and all the things that the orchestra and wind ensembles do really well that it's harder to do with fewer instruments. These very big dramatic gestures, like an orchestra can play a lot quieter and a lot louder than a small group, if only because there's more contrast between the quietest and the loudest that it can produce.
See, this is a really interesting conversation to me because I feel like I've found myself on the opposite path, like where I am primarily a chamber music composer. And I do have one orchestra piece, and I showed it to a teacher of mine. This was after, like, years after I graduated. I was like, "Can I have a lesson with you for this?" And so we sat down together, and he said, "This is kind of like a chamber piece." I was like, "Oh, okay," but I am with you. Like the variety of colors, just yeah, I don't know what it is about my music in particular that lends itself to chamber music, but I am really interested in timbre, and so of course it's like, yeah, I want to write like a large ensemble piece. I guess just maybe the way I handle like soloistic moments, maybe I don't know. Anyway, this isn't about me, so
Right. But I mean, a large ensemble can play chamber-like textures perfectly well.
yeah, right,
But if it's only that, then it's like, do you need 50 people on stage, or could you do the
exactly,
same with 20 or 10 or 5? I think the large ensembles benefit a lot from how do you use everyone together at certain points? And how do you use that huge variety of color to take advantage of the fact that, yeah, we had to hire 60 people for this. They're all on stage together, and it's a big room. It's a bigger room than you'd put a chamber ensemble in. And I think that opens up all these possibilities. I think of texture a lot when I'm composing. I remember very influential pieces that I studied were Ligeti's Atmospheres and some of his other music from the 60s. I remember asking for the score to Atmospheres for my birthday, and my parents had no idea what they're getting into. So they ordered that, and then this gigantic thing came, this way oversized score. It's like, I don't know, 3 feet tall. And it was so cool to study that and to see like all the strings were completely divided and everyone had their own part, and to see how they were all doing kind of the same thing, but at slightly different times with slightly different rhythms. But that idea of micropolyphony really connected with me and revealed like how can the orchestra sound like it's even more than an orchestra sometimes, like when you can't tell what every individual is doing, but it adds up to something that has to be that it can only be an orchestra being used that way.
right. Yeah, I love that. So besides instrumentation, do you approach writing for orchestra and writing for wind band differently, or do you feel like it's more or less the same approach?
I try to approach it in a pretty similar way, but I do know inherently there's a difference, and that is the orchestra has strings, and strings can do certain things that no combination of wind ensemble instruments can. And so there are some orchestra pieces I've written where I'm not even going to try to transcribe it for wind ensemble because I'd have to completely recompose so much about it. But there are others, like I just wrote a piece that I made the orchestra and band version at the same time. And when I was writing one of the versions, I was thinking about the other one at the same time and figuring out, okay, so if I'm doing this for the orchestra, then it's going to have to be slightly different for the band, but I know it's going to work because I'm starting from that place of it's for both. Yeah, it's strings can be transparent in ways that it's really hard to get a wind ensemble to do. And I think that's, I do have some orchestra pieces that could only be orchestra pieces,
Yeah.
but I think it's just conceptually different in that way. But the idea of having a ton of people in a large room playing together, I try to think of it in the same way of I can make these dramatic gestures. I can have everyone play together and it makes a huge impact when compared to when they're not playing together. I can, do all these things that'll work effectively for both, no matter, what combination of instruments I've got on stage.
Tyler here, interrupting this conversation just briefly to let you know that you can easily help power the Music Maker podcast and Loose Leaf Transmissions Network in a big time way by becoming a Patreon subscriber. By becoming a Patreon subscriber, you're supporting these fantastic conversations with makers in a real way. And one of the perks to being a subscriber is getting early access to episodes each week. And I've also launched a Patreon exclusive feature called The Workshop. Sort of like an audio journal where I share a little bit about my own creative process as it pertains to some current composition projects that I'm working on. Anyway, yes, that little bit of support on the Patreon, in fact, does go a long way in helping me cover the cost of some tools that I use to produce this podcast. So I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber by following the Patreon link in the show description of this episode, or you can log on to looseleaftransmissions.com/support. Really appreciate you getting back to me. And back to today's episode. So, shifting gears just a bit to talk more about what inspires your music. So much of what you've written has been inspired by scientific phenomena. So, when did you first become interested in science topics, and what keeps you returning to this in your music?
Yeah, I've always been interested in science outside of music. That was one of the subjects that I loved in school. I grew up with Mr. Wizard on the TV every morning when I was a little kid. That really dates me because that show was, I guess, it was filmed in the 70s and 80s or something. And like after Mr. Wizard, Bill Nye is more common to our generation. I
Yeah.
never even watched Bill Nye. It was Mr. Wizard that I remember growing up with, and so I loved thinking about all the science stuff. I loved watching what NASA was doing because growing up in Florida, this was the time of the space shuttle, and you could see those launches with your own eyes, even if you were nowhere near Cape Canaveral. And so it was exciting to see all those things they were doing. Science fiction became my favorite genre by far. I watched Star Wars more times than I could count when I was a kid. And I love the imagination of, just there's so much out there that's undiscovered that we don't know yet. And science is such a great way to figure these things out and to understand the universe and the world that we live in and why it works the way it does. And so when I didn't make the music connection until I was an undergrad, and I wrote a piece called Green Flash that it wasn't necessarily the science itself, but it was taking images from nature. The green flash is this atmospheric refraction that happens. Sometimes, if the temperature layers are just right, you get a little bit of green refracted from the sunlight, usually at a sunset. And it's rare to see. And I got to see one finally after studying it in an astronomy class when I was in high school. And so it was really cool to see that. And then I said, okay, I want to capture this feeling that I just had of seeing this finally in music, and this visual of seeing the sun. It's bright orange and red, and then suddenly there's a bit of green at the end that you don't expect. So I wrote Green Flash, and the Green Flash itself is the last like 2 seconds of the piece. So the rest of it was going through these scenes throughout the day from sunrise to sunset and looking at the shapes of clouds essentially and describing them. There's a morning fog, there are cirrus clouds that are all wispy, and trying to imitate those shapes within the orchestra. That piece then got me, towards writing more pieces about closer and closer to science phenomena that I enjoyed reading about and studying. I love hearing about what's being discovered in particle physics. That's been a big part of what I've done. And I wrote this piece inspired by the Large Hadron Collider back in 2012, right around when they were making the Higgs boson announcement.
Yeah.
So it was exciting to see, like, they built this incredible machine in Switzerland and under France. It's so big, it doesn't really fit in Geneva. And it's so powerful, too, that every other particle accelerator before it is now completely obsolete. And so, like the one that we had in the United States, they basically shut it down because there was no point running it anymore. They couldn't discover anything better than CERN could with the Large Hadron Collider. And so I wrote this piece for saxophone quartet and clarinet quartet. I kind of wrote them at the same time for both ensembles about particle physics. And like one of the movements, it takes the idea of quarks, these subatomic particles that are paired up. And so I pair musicians up and have them bounce off of each other. And another movement is about the immense amount of energy that is within the LHC. And so I've been writing that piece and many others that kind of get closer and closer to describing the actual science things. Quite often, it'll just be an image of something that I'll try to capture, but it comes from a scientific viewpoint. I've got other pieces like one called Aerodynamics that is not actually about like Bernoulli's principle, but it's more about free flight. And so, but with the title like Aerodynamics, actually, I had a performance of it, and someone came up to me afterwards and said they were at a fluid dynamics conference across the street, and they saw a program that had a piece called Aerodynamics, so they just had to go hear what that
Wow.
was like.
Yeah.
So it's started to make connections for me outside of the music world, and I've really enjoyed that too.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of my questions for you was, are scientific processes reflected in the musical process of these pieces at all? It sounds like the answer might be kind of sometimes, but also it's a combination of like your feelings about these phenomena or music that reflects the experience of these phenomena, not just the scientific process.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, sometimes I'll be closer to that. I wrote a piece called Far From Equilibrium. This was an amazing opportunity. I was contacted by an astrophysicist How many of us can say that's ever happened?
Right.
So it's like I got this email from an astrophysicist who did a project with a choreographer about the physics of turbulence. And that's what she studies. It's her name's Elizabeth Hicks, and she works in the Chicago area and does a lot of research in astrophysics, and especially of how turbulence happens at extremely high temperatures and pressures. But she wanted to find a way to describe what the stuff that she's been researching to the general public in a clear way. Because when you think of turbulence, you probably think of when you're on the airplane and it's bumpy, and that is a little bit of how it affects us. But there's so much more to the science behind turbulence. And so I got to work with Elizabeth and with choreographer Megan Rhyme on this project. They wanted to have me compose a brand new piece that these dancers would dance to. They had found music from the first time they did it, and the music wasn't quite fitting. So they wanted to have a new piece that actually fit the science principles and could really show the audience what this, what the science of turbulence is. And I had many lessons with Elizabeth where she would describe some of the principles, some of the math, the like different shapes as the energy of a fluid changes. You actually get patterns that are very predictable. Not the word you'd think with turbulence, but some things are very predictable before they become chaotic. And so she studies that because in order to understand turbulence, you have to find some model that's able to describe it. And it's really hard, but it must be possible. So we also talked a lot about chaos theory and attractors and strange attractors and the things that she has to deal with. Computer simulations even came up. Like one of the movements of this piece is essentially a computer simulation of let's take the same starting point and then see as it progresses to completely different amounts of chaos. Because there's something that is just impossible to measure that's going to change everything down the road, like butterfly flaps its wings kind of thing. So I learned all of this, and then I got to work with a choreographer too. That was really eye-opening to see like what is the process of how do dancers work versus how do I work as a musician. This is a time that I got to collaborate with Andy Hudson, who's a mutual friend of ours and such a great musician and loves to nerd out. And that's one of the ways that we connected. I wrote LHC for him, and then years later, I got to write Far From Equilibrium for him as well, where I explore all of these things. And so this piece is sort of like 4 movements that are each a snapshot of a different element of how does a scientist understand turbulence? How do they do the research to figure it out? And then you can see with the dancers, like, here's what it looks like if you can see every single molecule in water that's boiling. Like, that's what the dance is trying to do. And that's what the music also tried to do.
Can you give us an idea about how long this piece took to create? Because I mean, you're describing something where you had to like actively learn how to do stuff. You're like learning from the scientist, you're collaborating with dancers. Like it's a pretty like collaborative kind of project. I'd imagine it took some time, and then you have to write the music, of course. So
yeah, it took a while. It took definitely longer than I usually spend on a composition. I can write very quickly, and I did write parts of this very quickly, but the whole process, because I had to learn so much to understand what kind of music could even work. And even like it went through many iterations of what it could be in the beginning before I even put a note down. So this was one of the first times that I was approached not by musicians to write a piece, but by people outside of music. And I got to choose what I would write for, what instrumentation and all of that. And so my initial thought was I was working with Third Coast Percussion on some stuff. And so I asked them, hey, I got this project coming up. Are you free on these days when they have the hall? And they weren't. So it's too bad I didn't get a chance to work with them on this, but it worked out great that I got to work with Andy Hudson instead. And we put together a clarinet quartet, and that's what it ended up being. So from the beginning of the process to the end, it probably took at least half a year.
Oh,
which,
okay,
yeah, it was longer than most of my pieces take. I usually write, even my bigger scale pieces, I write within 2 to 3 months at the longest. Like some of my 20 plus minute concertos, usually I finish them within that time frame. But this piece was more like 6 months of work, mostly of learning what was even possible and just conceptualizing and big picture things and working with figuring out what the dancers could do and how that could then relate to the music. But it was such an enriching experience.
I believe it.
Yeah, to do that, to learn how does a choreographer think, also how does an astrophysicist think, how do they come up with new ideas. how do they test those ideas and make sure that they work. One of the topics that came up many times was that failure is not a bad thing. It's actually a positive thing. It's part of the process. It tells you one thing that didn't work and then helps you along the path to find the thing that does. And we all experience failure in various ways and various times, and it's usually a letdown, but it's better to think of it as, here's a thing. You've now explored one thing that's not going to work, and that's fine, because now you're not going to do that again. It doesn't work. And it kind of opens doors to other things that maybe will work.
You just beautifully illustrated, how a composer might collaborate on a really deep level with someone like a scientist. But I also know you've been in residency at like Fermilab,
Mm-hmm.
and also you mentioned earlier the Large Hadron Collider. That's like something you wrote music about, and you were there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So what have these? I mean, can you talk a little more about what these experiences have been like, and the ways in which these experiences have galvanized your music?
Yeah, it's so incredible to get opportunities to meet non-musicians and work with them and learn their language. That's another big part of it, of figuring out how do you talk about the same thing, because if I use technical musical terms, they won't know it. And if they use their technical terms, I won't know it. And so finding that common language between us, I think, enriches both of our abilities to be creative. And I got very lucky to connect with someone who works at CERN, where they run the LHC. This happened. I was the saxophone version of LHC. I was working with the Sinta Quartet, who were all students of Donald Sinta at the University of Michigan. I got to know them when I was a doctoral student there, and they premiered the saxophone version of that piece and played it a bunch. And Dan Grazer, the leader of that group, had the idea to think, well, let's look up who teaches at the University of Michigan that maybe has a connection to science, that we can then find more opportunities for this. And he discovered that a guy named Stephen Goldfarb was a researcher at the University of Michigan, but also was the education and outreach coordinator for CERN.
Oh, wow.
So it was like the perfect connection. We sent an email to him and found out that they had actually already been putting on this music and physics program for the last few years, where they had a bunch of different guests and scientists and musicians come in and make connections between music and physics in a lot of different ways. And it was perfect to, add this saxophone quartet. So we all got a chance. I was in Switzerland with the Sinta Quartet for a number of days. We got to go to CERN, meet some scientists there. We got to actually, very luckily, go inside the LHC, which you can only do when it's not in use. So they happened to be upgrading some of the equipment at that time, and so it was open. And we got to go in. It's 6 floors underground. It is this gigantic cavern, and that's just the size of the detectors. The beam itself is this little tiny tube that runs through the middle of it. So it's amazing. They're making these gigantic explosions of weird particles that go through this immense space just to figure out, what is matter made of and why does it do what it does? And so getting a chance to experience, like, this is the world that they live in, and learn more about, what that has done for science, what CERN has done for technology as well. Like, they really developed internet technology there because they had to. There's so much data being transferred so quickly by the detectors that it forced them to get better at moving data. So, learning about all these things, I think, has helped give me more ideas for how can I then use music to explain these things to other people. I think music is a great medium, just as dance is, to show something to someone who doesn't know about that thing yet. And so, like Far From Equilibrium, you learn a lot by just watching it of, how does a scientist see turbulence? How do they understand turbulence? And so these other pieces I've written about particle physics are doing a similar thing, where I can take this concept and then explore it musically and present it in a way that certainly a scientific paper would lose most of its readers if they're not scientists.
Right.
And maybe a diagram would lose fewer people, but still it might not make sense to everyone. But those of people who hear music and are able to, feel it in a similar way that I do, they'd understand completely my understanding of, like, quantum field theory is a newer example. I wrote a piano piece about that. And, it was fun to explore that theory, but then to take that idea and say, what does music sound like if it tries to show what that theory is saying to everyone? And it turned into a piece of music that I never thought I would write and stylistically, because it's so different, because the style needed to be different to explain this really strange concept of what we think, how the universe works.
Yeah. How have audiences responded to these projects you're talking about? Because I mean, you're touching on it a little bit in a general sense, but I mean, do you have to like go out on stage and kind of explain things just a little bit, or is the music just enough for people to be like, oh, okay, I kind of see it?
It's great when I can explain it before, and people really appreciate that because they then understand, like, how did I go from that idea to this piece of music, and it augments their understanding. I can only explain it so well because I'm not a scientist, and so I have like a popular science understanding of most of these things. And more interesting is sometimes when people hear a piece of mine and they didn't get that explanation beforehand. And sometimes I'll get really positive responses, but they'll think it's about something entirely different, and I'm fine with that because that tells me my music is connecting with them, even if they don't know what its origin is supposed to be. It's still connecting with them, and that's what music needs to do. It needs to make a connection. So it's like Green Flash. I had a performance of that at some point, and someone came up to me afterwards and said they loved that piece, and they could hear like the fight scene. And I was thinking, wait, what? Because it's about clouds and sunrise and
Yeah.
sunset and this atmospheric thing. They thought it was about comic book heroes like Green Lantern or the
Oh, yeah.
Flash. They didn't read the program notes, and they still enjoyed the piece. They just thought it was about something else. And so that happens sometimes. But my philosophy is that music has to speak for itself, even if you don't know what it's supposed to be about. And, hopefully, if you know what it's about, it augments the experience. But otherwise, I think the music needs to stand on its own without that, if possible.
Not to put you on the spot, but and I'm sure this might be a difficult question to answer. What has been like your all-time favorite science topic that you've learned through these projects?
Hmm. Science is just so fascinating. There's so many different fields of study, so many different ways that we can look at things. Probably some of the more recent things. I mean, turbulence was amazing to study. I learned so much about that. I think more recently, though, getting to spend time at Fermilab and learn about the new research that they're doing, and what they're doing now is they're trying to understand neutrinos. So I'll back up. Fermilab is the United States National Laboratory in Particle Physics. So they're like, I don't know how many national laboratories, but this is the one that's dedicated to having particle accelerators and smashing little bits of matter together just to see what happens. And it's located right outside Chicago. They've had an artist in residence program for a couple decades, I think. The founder of Fermilab, Bob Wilson, was also a visual artist. He was a sculptor and a painter. And so aesthetics was always very important to him when they were building Fermilab. And in response to that aesthetic value that they have there, they've had this artist in residence program. And more recently, they've added a composer in residence. They've got a call for proposals every year, and I was very fortunate to be chosen a couple years ago for that. And I got to visit the site. I got to meet scientists, theoretical physicists, as well as technicians who work on the actual physical elements of keeping the place up and running and doing the amazing things that it does.
Yeah.
I got to visit all the kind of offshoots of the particle physics. Like they have a huge cryogenics lab because they need that for the particle accelerator work. But it also means they have quantum computers there, which also needs cryogenics. And they do all these amazing things that aren't necessarily smashing particles together. But I got to learn about their current focus, which is the neutrino. Neutrinos are these tiny particles, they're elementary particles that almost never interact with anything else. And they're absurdly common because they never interact. When particles interact, they usually turn into other particles or disappear or into energy or something like that. But because these are doing that so little, and they're made in such large numbers, there are actually trillions of them going through you every second, and you don't notice. And that's good because that's a lot. But there are three different kinds of neutrinos, and I love that scientists call them three different flavors. It's a great analogy, and I love that they have a sense of humor about it. But three different flavors of neutrinos. Now, normally particles just stay being the particle that they are, but neutrinos don't do that. They just spontaneously switch between those three different flavors of neutrino. And we don't know why this happens because each of those neutrinos has different properties that we've been able to measure. So it seems like it's this impossibility, but we've observed them changing. And so they're building this project right now called DUNE, which is the Deep Underground Neutrino Experiment, where they're creating a whole bunch of neutrinos at Fermilab in Chicago and shooting them through a detector right there on site and verifying exactly what kinds of neutrinos they have, because every now and then you get an interaction and you can tell what it is. But then they're shooting it through the Earth's crust, 800 miles, to another detector that they're building, which is, they just excavated, I think, 800 million tons of rock or some large amount of rock in South Dakota at another national lab, the Sanford Lab, to build this really gigantic detector and figure out, okay, in those 800 miles, what's changed about the neutrinos that they've made at Fermilab? And they're hoping that that'll help them understand a little bit more about why these neutrinos are doing what they're doing, because there's a possibility that understanding that will help them understand a lot of other things, like dark matter. Why can't we see most of the matter that clearly exists based on observation, except for we can't see it? So what is it, and why is it affecting everything else so much? Dark energy as well. Maybe there's a connection between that. Why is the universe expanding and accelerating? Not just like getting a little bit bigger, but it's getting so much bigger that there are places in the universe that we can no longer reach if we can't go faster than the speed of light. So, there are so many questions that we have unanswered, and it's exciting to see like what they have to do to figure out, just to have a chance of maybe answering one of those questions. Something that came up with the Far From Equilibrium group in our discussions was that quite often what you really want is more questions, because that's more productive. Answering a question is great, but it's going to make more questions. And that's where you are really learning about the nature of things, when the next question to ask. Because right now we don't even know the next question until we do this research.
Yeah. So this is just all a bunch of stuff I never imagined talking about on an arts podcast. So I really appreciate you for that.
Yeah. Well, now how did I turn that into music? Is the next question.
Right.
Yeah, because I love exploring all that, but now my task is to write a piece of music that somehow captures what I've learned in a musical way. And I decided to go with writing a piece with the target musician of high school and college musicians. I love working with young musicians. I love seeing their enthusiasm. I mean, that's when I started composing, when I was in high school. And I see, they're learning so much. They don't have all these judgments that us older people have about, what works and what doesn't yet. Everything seems possible to them. And so I love being able to not only write music for them, but also connect that music to other things in ways that they wouldn't imagine. Like writing a piece. It's called Deep Underground, that I just finished about half a year ago. And I put together a consortium of high school and college wind ensembles and orchestras. This is actually the piece I was talking about writing for orchestra and band at the same time. And so there are going to be maybe 20 to 30 performances of this in the next year, and then hopefully many more, with the opportunity of all of these students getting to learn about what Fermilab is doing in their new neutrino research. And the first movement describes this new particle accelerator. The cool thing is, when they build a building to house like hydrogen, which is what they're going to put in the accelerator, they don't just make a rectangular building. They make a rectangular building with windows that are shaped as the same way as the spectrogram of hydrogen.
Oh, wow.
So when you shine light through something, then hydrogen puts certain lines that it kind of blots out. That's a unique fingerprint of that element. Every element will do slightly different arrangement of those lines, and that's what they have on the side of their building. So I took those arrangement of lines that they turned into windows, and I took that and made it into a rhythm that then accelerates over the course of this first movement, to kind of envision how do these protons are accelerated to some absurdly fast speed, about 80% of the speed of light. And then the second movement takes these neutrinos, and the ensemble acts like neutrinos. People come in and out, and I try to keep it as straightforward as possible. It's like one pitch that comes in and out. That's a neutrino. But there are three flavors. So it starts out with just those one kind of a neutrino, and then a minute or so into it, a new kind of neutrino, a trill that comes in and out, starts happening. And then a third kind of neutrino, a bunch of repeated notes that slow down, starts to show up. And so as the movement progresses, these neutrinos are traveling from Illinois to South Dakota, and they're changing. And towards the end of this, I let the musicians just choose at will those three different gestures on the same pitch. How do they be a neutrino, essentially? And so they learn about neutrino oscillation. I didn't know about neutrino oscillation until I went to Fermilab a year ago and discovered it there. Not that you need to know about neutrino oscillation to live your life, but it's an interesting thing, I think, because
Yeah.
it's something that shouldn't happen as far as we understand science. So there must be some question that we haven't asked yet that we need to know the answer to make that make sense.
Does Fermilab know about this specific piece of yours where you're using these concepts in music to educate young people?
Yeah, they're actually
Yeah.
really excited about this fact. I think most of the other composers and residents have written really cool stuff, but it's been for like chamber ensembles in that area, in Chicago-based chamber ensembles would come and play it there, and that would be cool. And you'd have this piece of art that is really well connected to something that they do at Fermilab. But I think I'm the first one to write something not just for professional people to play, but for younger people to play. And so the person who coordinates all of this is part of the education department in Fermilab, and they've been so excited that I've decided to connect young people with this. They're putting together right now an interactive workshop that they can send a scientist out to a school, have that scientist meet the students who are playing this piece, describe the science behind it, and describe what Fermilab does and how it all works there. I know they've done that with one of the schools that have already played the piece, and it was just so amazing for the students to meet the scientist. Also, the scientist who came happened to also play in a rock band
Oh, wow.
and writes
Yeah.
songs about physics. So
Yeah.
there's this connection. Science and art can be connected, and Fermilab does that in an incredible way. Just like walking around that campus is amazing because you'll see these patterns. They've got Feynman diagrams on the walls, which are these beautiful things that describe particle interactions and transformations. And they remove all the labels, and it just looks like this really cool abstract art. But it means something to the scientists. And so it just adds this layer of meaning. If you look up the building, like the Wilson building, which is the main building, it's this beautiful, amazing architecture that's just unlike any other building I've seen. It's like the walls slope up to a point at the top. There was another place with a double helix staircase, just because why not? Here's a science connection you could make. Otherwise, you just make a normal spiral staircase that's boring. But let's make two spirals that make a DNA strand.
And for them to have a residency program like what you're talking about shows that they see the importance in what we do as well.
Yeah, that art is a great way for people to learn about things that aren't just art. It's a way to connect art to anything else. And yeah, the more and more I've written about science concepts, the more I've explored, like, how can I explain something to someone else using music? I wrote a piece called Okiokul Requiem that you had on Modern Notebook, and that piece very much takes like the shape of a graph of climate data, and I turned that into pitches and tempo. And so it creates a musical statement out of a graph. And over the course of the time, you feel something that's different than just looking at a graph, which you see in a split second.
Right. So with all of this in mind, what would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice?
One of the most important pillars for my creative process is goal orientation. I want my music to head towards a moment where it reveals something, whether it's the scientific concept or the payoff of a story, or something to do with how is this going to deliver a message that becomes clear. Always working towards a goal, having a reason for every note, having a direction for every line. I think very line oriented. A lot of times I'm using colors and textures and things that might feel static, but I'm always thinking, like, how is that progressing to the next place? And how am I making something inevitable? I'm struck, but when I listen to music, especially tonal music, does this perfectly every time. It creates a sense of expectations when you listen to it, where this certain chord wants to go to this other chord, and when you hear that chord, you're happy you heard it. When you hear a different chord, you're surprised. And sometimes it's a good surprise, sometimes it's not a surprise you like, but it's definitely not what you expected. And the composer is able to control that to then create emotions in the listener that are really interesting, that it does that simply by having this one combination of sounds and then another. Especially when I'm creating a new harmonic language that maybe is even unfamiliar to me. It's the first time I'm trying this out. I think, like, okay, what can I make that is inevitable, that goes from one place and it has to go to another place? So I can then build this expectation in the listener, and then I can either satisfy it or dash that expectation as I'm going along to create this sense of narrative, of telling a story, of, you know, saying that this is supposed to do this, and maybe it will and maybe it won't. So I really think about line. I'm a very visual person when I think about sound. I'm not synesthetic. Like when I listen to music, I don't see colors. I don't even see shapes, but I think I feel like the shape of the music. And so
Sure,
that's why I
yeah.
think of lines so much. I've got pieces that are simply, I've got a piece called Tangents that's all about lines bouncing off of each other. So to take a very simple mathematical idea, but then apply it to music. And I'm not like using actual graphs to build these lines or any kind of math processes. I'm just saying, okay, here's a fast moving line, and I'm going to bounce it off another fast moving line. And that's what the whole piece is about, and see where
Hmm.
it goes.
When you talk about venturing into new tonal language, inventing tonal languages even for your pieces, but then also creating a set of expectations or that you either, embrace or defy in some ways. I mean, my understanding of that is that you're having to like craft everything from the ground up. Is that the case, or are you kind of leaning into existing expectations you might find in other music, or
Mm.
can you kind of unravel that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a combination of both. It's mostly just taking what already exists and what music do I already know. If I write a tonal piece, then I know the rules of tonality that we understand. And so I know if I write this chord next, what's going to happen to the listener. But when I'm writing something that I don't want to be the same harmonic language as other music that already exists, when I'm trying to find, something that's a little bit more unique to me, then it's usually a combination of lots of things that I like. It's like a little bit of triadic harmony, a little bit of other kinds of techniques, a little bit of let's not have a pitch center here for a little bit, or maybe let's have a pitch center, but let's not organize the pitches around that in the same way that a normal scale might. And so I like to kind of reinvent some of those elements, but I can't reinvent all of them at once. I guess you could do that if you completely reinvent tonality, like with new tuning systems and all of that. I haven't really explored new tuning systems because that would definitely be an unfamiliar area for most of us with Western ears. But yeah, it's a combination of what do I know? What are the expectations I have when I hear these two chords in a row or these two pitches in a row? And then how do I then use consistency to teach the audience who's listening to this piece? Because I know maybe they have one chance to listen to it, and it's the only
Right.
time they'll ever hear it. I want to make sure that they understand, why did I do that next note the way I did it. I want to surprise them if it's not what they expected. And so it's this combination of all the music that I've ever heard and studied. And I like that. And I feel like when I went to all those countless concerts as a kid, I didn't realize how useful it was for me to listen to such a huge variety of music, and also to be taking those binoculars and following along in the score for so many of them, because I was internalizing the things I liked about Dvorak and about Borodin and Beethoven and Mozart and more recent composers. Whenever they would show up, I would absorb little bits of their language, and whether I was conscious of it or not, they'd come back when I started composing, and those ideas helped me understand if I was doing something that would create a sense of expectation or not.
Yeah. I think I interrupted you sharing your pillars. So I don't
Well,
know
that's all right. That's
if there's more you want to share, please feel free.
I think that's the main thing. I mean, thinking visually was what I was talking about. Really trying to make music that goes a little bit beyond just being notes and rhythms, but creates a sense beyond just listening to the listener, because that's what I feel when I'm creating it. And when I listen to music, I feel like I feel the drama in a different way. It's hard to explain because I'm not synesthetic, because I don't like see blue when I hear these pitches or red
Yeah.
when I hear those pitches. It's more the sense of maybe that's why texture is so important to me, because that creates this really clear sense of like a tactile or a shape sense that goes in addition to the oral sense and relates to the visual sense. When I hear a musical line move up and down, I feel uplifting and descending in those ways. And I've explored that a lot in my compositions. There are a number of number of pieces I've written about flying. So like aerodynamics and a few others, where I'm trying to use musical devices to create a sense of weightlessness or of extreme momentum, and try to connect to senses beyond just your listening.
I totally feel you. I think, and this is speaking of my own music, but there's something very unsatisfying when I'm not exploring like deeper layers of what music can be. If it's just like, oh, it's a melody with a little harmonic accompaniment, it's like that's not really enough for what I'm trying to do, right? And,
Hmm.
and so I really get where you're coming from when it comes to motion in music or texture or colors. I mean, all these kind of things we've been talking about this whole time just are super important values to me personally. And I think that's when I find like pieces that do those things, it is satisfying to experience that as a listener.
Yeah, it augments your experience and it creates more possibilities than you'd expect. And those possibilities could be anything. I love that.
Exactly. So you mentioned on your website, and I want to bring this up because it's like kind of it almost feels like the opposite of what we've been talking about with science and whatnot. But you mentioned that mythology is also an interest of yours. So I'm wondering if you feel like there's a correlation between science and mythology that makes you attracted to both, and otherwise, like how does mythology influence your work?
Yeah, mythology and literature in general, I think is great for me because it's got a sense of story, of narrative, and that ties into my goal orientation. That the I think music should be headed towards something that's inevitable and reveals something about the music you're listening to. And so while it's not science, and maybe it is the opposite of science in some cases, where I find my musical materials might come from a very different place. The idea of explaining something through music, I think, is very much the same to me. Yeah, my clarinet concerto is called Benu's Fire, and it's all about the myth of the phoenix bird. Benu is the Egyptian version of the Greek phoenix bird, and each movement tells a different part of its story. It's reborn from its ashes, and the first and third movements are all about that. The middle movements about the phoenix song myth of the Greek legends, where gods would stop in the middle of this what they were doing because the phoenix's song was so beautiful, and taking a clarinet solo and trying to spin a musical line that could essentially stop time because it was what is it, Apollo's chariot would stop in the middle of the sky if it was hearing the phoenix song, because and then time stops essentially. So trying to achieve that goal in music, I think is really great. And it's not about science at all. It's about this other storytelling element that I think music does really well.
Yeah, and I think also maybe in thinking about that type of storytelling, I mean, I suppose you could like approach science with storytelling in that regard. Like it kind of maybe
Definitely.
feeds one
Yeah, I
another.
think a lot of science is explaining processes. How does one thing change from one state to another state? How do we understand why that happens and how it happens? And like thinking about Far From Equilibrium, like the first movement is about putting heat in a fluid and watching it boil and turn in from, something that's pretty much static in the beginning to completely chaotic in the end. And so it tells the story of what happens when, I add a little bit more velocity and a little bit more activity to each part. And all the dancers begin moving a little bit faster over the course until suddenly all of the patterns that you see break open into chaos. And so certainly there could be a literary version of that as well.
Talking about literature is the perfect segue to my next question because maybe a piece of literature is an answer that you might have for this. But the question I ask everybody is, what is a piece of music or a song, a book, a piece of art, a piece of literature, any kind of artistic artifact? And I'll even like expand that to like an experience maybe that you've had as well. Any of that kind of stuff that's changed the way that you think about your creative work, maybe changed your life, had like a super big impact on your creative thinking.
If I can give two answers, one a piece of music and one another experience for this, the piece of music, I remember in high school I just started composing, and I didn't really know much about what was out there besides classical music and a little bit of the pop music that I wasn't as interested in. But I remember reading a book about composition, and it was explaining scordatura, so retuning string instruments so that the strings are not what you expect them to be, and that opens up possibilities for new kinds of sounds and all of that. And it kind of nonchalantly mentioned this piece by Giacinto Scelsi called Trilogia for solo cello. And so I just made a note of that piece. And then I think it took me a while to find a recording of it because it's not recorded very much. And if you ever listen to it, you'll know why. It's a mind blowing piece. And I remember I was in ninth grade or something, and I was listening to this piece. I'd never heard anything remotely like it before. It starts out very much like one note and two notes, and then it goes nuts, and there are all these weird sounds that I never thought a cello could make. It's incredible, and that just opened my mind to the fact that music can be so many more things than I ever thought it could be, and there must be more out there for me to be able to explore. Now that I've decided to write notes down that can explain things through music, that can tell a story or that can create a sensation in the listener. There's a huge palette that I don't even know about yet,
Yeah.
and that I think that listening to that piece when I was in ninth grade just blew my mind. And years later, that really prompted me to be more curious and to explore things. Anytime I was looking for music, like in the library or in other places, whenever there was a composer I didn't recognize, that was the first thing I wanted to listen to, just to experience something new and find out, what did they do that I'd never thought of before, and could open my mind to other possibilities.
Have you had an opportunity to explore these techniques in the Chelsea piece in your own music? Or was it simply like, wow, this is awesome. I want to find out. I just want to learn more about music now.
I've actually never really used most of those techniques. It was like putting mutes on one string so that you get this buzzing on the C string.
Yeah.
There is scordatura, which I've never done that in a piece that I'm actually serious about. I tried doing that for some things, and I don't think I've ever actually used that in a composition that I've put out in the world. But yeah, all those techniques I never really used. But I think it's just the possibilities of there's more that you can do than just what you thought you could from before the 20th century. That really prompted me to be curious, and I've never stopped being curious. I actually really appreciate Modern Notebook, that I'm able to get 2 hours of new music that you're finding all this great stuff. It's very diverse, and that's what I appreciate about it, that I'm hearing all these things that I never would have thought of every week. And before that, I don't get that many opportunities to go to new music concerts, especially
Yeah.
where I'm living now. It's a small town. University puts on so many shows, but there's only so many. But to have a resource where you can just find new music that you've never heard before and never would have thought to listen to before, that's such a valuable thing as a composer, because it keeps me on my toes. It keeps me thinking, there's always something more that I don't know that I can do as a composer.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. So there was the Chelsea moment, and then there was an experience that you had also.
Yeah, I think so. I mentioned a piece called Aerodynamics that's about flying, and that it's one of many pieces I've written about that. When I was living in LA, I went to Disneyland, and I went to California Adventure, and this brand new ride was opening up called Soarin' California. And if you've been to Epcot, they've got a version of it there that's, I think it's just called Soarin', but they essentially they suspend you in a chair with your legs dangling as if you're in a hang glider, and then they fly you over California scenes, and they spray air at you and scents. Like if you're flying over a pine forest, you smell a pine forest. But it was such an amazing experience. I remember doing the single rider so I could skip most of the line over and over. I went on it like 4 or 5 times in a row,
Yeah.
just because I couldn't get enough of that experience. And so I've been quite often trying to capture that feeling of, having fast momentum, having the wind at your face. What does that sound like? I don't even know what the music was in that ride anymore, because I've written so many different versions of what I think music could do to make you feel that way. I'll have to look that up sometime just to see like how different or the same it is from some of the pieces I've written. But that really moved me. I've never been hang gliding myself, but that sense of freedom and that sense of just like being so immersed in something has really led me to write music where I try to achieve some level of immersion for the listener. I want them to feel like they're within something. This is probably why I love writing for large ensembles more, because when
Right.
you're in a big room with 70 people playing, you can really feel in the middle of all of it. It's not intimate like a chamber ensemble. It's this big, massive thing potentially that you can be lost in.
Do you write much music that is like wholly immersive, or is it just achieving that through large ensemble writing? And I guess I could mean like antiphonal stuff or, surround sound.
I've done that a few times, and I've really enjoyed that experience of, trying to put the listener in an unusual sonic experience, in addition to just like being, in the normal stage musicians audience sitting out, not on the stage, that kind of typical concert experience. I wrote a piece called Bioluminescence, where I surround the audience with triangle players.
Oh, that's awesome.
And there's a vibraphone on stage playing this line, and all the triangle players just they have spatially notated parts, and they're following the vibraphone. just controlling, when I tell people to play, you get the sense of behind you, there's a bunch of dings, and then in front of you, and then it moves around the room. I love playing around with those ideas. I just wrote a clarinet trio that was premiered in Dublin at Clarinet Fest. It's called Entanglement. And so there's a scientific topic of, you've got particles that then get entangled with each other. And so no matter how far apart they go, they still share properties with each other. And I tried doing that with a chamber ensemble. And I take these three clarinetists, and the bass clarinet sits there, but the two B flat clarinets, eventually they're doing all this virtuosic stuff. And eventually they walk around and surround the audience and continue to do this very tight virtuosic stuff. So bigger the room, the more difficult it is, but the more effective I think that experience of being within this really interesting setting for music, I think, could be. I've only done that a handful of times, but I really like those possibilities, and I definitely want to explore them more.
But also to your earlier point, I mean, you don't need to do like surround sound stuff to evoke like an immersive experience, of
Right.
course.
Yeah. And having like using a chamber ensemble, right? Even you can make textures that are varied enough to make you feel like you're within some kind of setting, as opposed to just listening to music. It's like trying to change the setting from you're sitting in a concert hall to you're experiencing something is what a lot of my music tries to do.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. So I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about your Blue Dot Collective, which we have not talked about yet, but I was reading about it online, and specifically on the collective's website, it says that you all aim to write adventurous new music for wind band. And so we've talked a little bit about wind band already, and we've both acknowledged also that wind band is one space where new music is like totally embraced, I think. So I'm really interested through that lens. Like, this is an ensemble that is well acquainted with new music, but how do you specifically, and I guess you as a group, approach this kind of adventurous mentality through this collective?
Yeah, we all really believe in each other's art. I think that's what drew us together. So the collective was started, organized by Ben Taylor, and he called me up and he talked to a few other friends, including Dave Biedenbender, Viet Quang, Jess Turner, Omar Thomas, Jen Jolly. We're all a part of this group together. Part of it was to help us have a presence at conferences like Midwest and to support each other at those places. And we learned a lot from being able to do that, from having a booth at Midwest and seeing, like, from 2000, was it 2016 was the first year, maybe 17, all the way up until the present. We've continued to have a booth. We've continued to have a presence there and to learn, like, what do wind ensemble directors, what are they looking for? What kinds of connections can we make there? That's been extremely valuable. But we all really value each other's art. We all enjoy listening to and learning from each other's compositions. And we all have that shared aspiration of writing for wind band and being able to do that a lot. And so it's been a perfect way for us to create opportunities in that area. And certainly, Viet Quang is just doing such amazing things. I love his music. I'm really glad to hear some pieces that I hadn't heard before on Modern Notebook recently. That's been a lot of fun. Yeah, I love the creativity he has. We met, actually, unrelated to Blue Dot. He was a student at Peabody, an undergrad, while I was a master's student there, and we just happened to meet. And then, the rest is history. We've done so many things in similar areas together since then, and become really great friends. So yeah, it's a lot of supporting each other, but also of having that presence. It's very difficult to afford to be at Midwest and to have, it's definitely something that's run by an industry that it needs to be, but it's essentially made by the publishing companies to help their music, all the new selections of music that they have, get out every year. Not every composer needs to have a publishing company represent them, though, especially today. We see, like, I remember when Jennifer Higdon won the Pulitzer Prize as a self-published composer. That was the first time that any Pulitzer Prize had gone to someone not being represented by a company other than themselves. And that was incredible because we really live in a different time than we did just 20 years ago, where you can, especially in the wind ensemble world, because they all talk about what they're playing and what new exciting things they're doing. You can just make your own presence and make those connections yourself and not need someone else to do that for you, and be successful and have a lot of performances of wind ensemble music and get a lot of opportunities to continue writing more of it. So that's been great. Remember, one of the first things that we discovered when we went there first couple years was everyone kept on asking us, do we have any grade 1 and 2 music that they're looking
Yeah.
for their elementary and their middle school bands? And like none of us had anything less than grade 3 at that point. And even that grade 3, maybe we only had 1 or 2 pieces like that level. So we quickly got the idea we need to have more beginning music. And that helped me kind of get into that mindset of, okay, how do you write a piece that is musically satisfying? That's always our most important thing. It needs to be worth it musically, but is also playable by people who just picked up their instrument for the first time like a month ago. And maybe they learned to read a couple notes. You know, grade 1, technically you're supposed to use like only a handful of pitches, the first handful of pitches that everyone learns. It's actually grade 5.5. That's supposed to be only the first 6 pitches that everyone learns, which is a challenge because you think, well, that limits you to certain kinds of harmonies. Even if you have all 6 of those pitches played at once, then you get something that's not even that dissonant, compared to what it could be. And so it limits the language that you're able to use, but it shouldn't limit your creativity. I think it actually increases your creativity when you have those restrictions, because while it may be paralyzing at first, once you figure out, oh, I can do this thing using only, quarter notes, half notes, and whole notes, and I can do that thing, and I can teach them one new thing. I can't teach them 2 new things because then the teacher will have to spend too long on this piece, and they won't like that. But if I teach them one thing, then I can make them do this really interesting thing, or I can have them like make this other sound that isn't on their instrument that maybe they were told they shouldn't do that, but this time they get to. So they're going to, those kids are going to feel special that they get to make this weird noise in this piece because they're told it's allowed. And so I love to be able to find those things and engage, and like also think like, okay, what does a 6th grader really, what engages them as a person? So if they're playing a piece of music that's called composition number 1, then that doesn't give them something to connect with. They're just playing notes and rhythms, and hopefully they'll be able to play those notes and rhythms, but there won't be anything special about it necessarily. But if they play a piece, like I wrote a piece called Asimo that's about this robot, the very old style, kind of clunky looking robot, but it was a huge advance in robotics back from the early 2000s. It conducted the Detroit Symphony and a public stunt and all of that. It was fun. And so I found out that the school that was commissioning me had a great robotics program. So I decided, okay, I'll write a piece for them that is about robotics and, make that connection where this piece is about something that they know about or that they can explore and that they are already excited about. And then they'll approach the musical challenges with a little bit more enthusiasm than if it was just like a kind of vague, abstract thing.
I mean, it sounds like it's not just adventurous for the ensembles that you're writing for. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's like adventurous for you guys too, from a creativity perspective.
Yeah, we love it. I mean, writing all these beginning pieces. We all got a commission from a middle school to write grade 1 pieces, so for beginners, but using an element that is not part of grade 1, and that would be compound meters.
Oh, okay,
so
yeah.
Compound meters like 6/8 and 9/8 aren't supposed to be in grade 1 because I don't know why, but even though so much music that we inherently know, you think like, what Christmas carols do you know that are in compound time? A lot of them. Yeah, what folk songs are in compound time? A lot of them. We just inherently know the feeling of that, but you aren't taught to read compound time until sometime like a year or 2 later than when you start your instrument, which doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So we were all tasked with writing like a 1-minute long piece that used the first 6 pitches that everyone learned, maybe with 1 or 2 extras, but really kind of restrict that. But to use compound time so that it can be a way that a teacher could teach it to their beginners. That doesn't feel overwhelming. It's not like you're jumping up to more complicated pitches and, oh, here's a new meter to read with different beaming and all this stuff that you've never seen before. So I think we really enjoyed that process and creating something that, had this ability to go a little bit beyond what it normally would have been. To use, mine was in 9/8. It's called Interstellar Tarantella, and it's a tarantella that's, most tarantellas aren't in 9/8. They're in like 6/8 or 12/8. So I decided to make it from outer space. So, there's a way that kids could get excited. It's very cheesy, but I still restricted my use of rhythms within the 9/8, and it's something that is then approachable by beginning students.
Quite honestly, it sounds fun to do. as a composer.
Yeah. Yeah. I love doing residencies with beginning musicians. It's great when you get to work with professionals because, the musicality is just through the roof. You get to do all these really nuanced things all the time. But when you work with a middle school group or with a high school group, there's so much enthusiasm there. You can work on those musical things. You have to work on more technical things sometimes too. But they also really appreciate meeting a composer. And this is like, I never got this through my school. I only got it from outside of school when I was that age. Strangely enough, I got to meet Elliot Del Borgo, who is a composer who wrote a lot of educational music, and I was playing a whole bunch of those pieces. But my dad was a real estate agent, and he had an email come across his desk, and it was from a name that seemed familiar to him because he'd been to my concerts and he'd seen Elliot Del Borgo on those programs, and so he verified, yes, that was the Elliot Del Borgo who was looking to buy a house in Florida and
Oh, that's
have a
funny.
second home down there. And so I actually got to hang out with Elliot and his wife. And Elliot passed away a few years ago, but I got to meet him. And I was still in high school at this point, and I'd just been composing for a little bit. So yeah, he and Lucas Foss were the two first composers that I got to meet. And that was just a complete coincidence how he ended up,
Yeah, that's crazy.
with me for a day.
Yeah. So jumping into my final set of questions, and these are questions I ask everybody, and I think I might know the answer to this, but what do you think you would be doing if it wasn't your art, if you weren't composing or doing any kind of music, anything at all?
I thought long and hard about that. And I guess being a scientist probably would have been what I ended up doing because I always loved studying science
Yeah.
through school. Actually, didn't really enjoy math until a little later on. And so maybe that would have held me back a little bit because there's so much math that you have to deal with in science. That's why now I like popular science as opposed to like really digging into the numbers. But I think I probably would have ended up in some kind of science field. I love astronomy. And of course, watching a lot of science fiction, especially things that go into outer space, being able to spend my career thinking out in outer space and observing the stuff out there, that probably would have been really fulfilling. But I don't know. It's hard because music has been such a big part of my life since such an early age. I started piano lessons at 5. And while all my friends were like playing sports or doing other things, I was practicing piano. And then eventually I was composing. And I really didn't do that many other things besides that, in addition to my just normal schoolwork.
Yeah. So I did expect you to say something related to science for your answer.
Mhm.
So maybe I'll just, to keep things more interesting and spicy here, I'll add on. Can you imagine yourself doing anything that would not even be science related? Like if no music, no science, and maybe not.
Yeah, probably something with computers. Like that was another thing that was a presence in my household. Some of my older brothers were early adopters of PCs, so we had things before Windows. We had like a Tandy 8000. Is that it? We had some very old personal computers. I think one of them wrote a program, a very basic program, and won something in a magazine. And so we got like a free computer from that. And so we always
wow.
had
Yeah.
desktop computers in the house as long as I can remember, which this was back in the early 90s. So not everyone had one or needed one. You really didn't need one for a while in the 80s in particular. But so those were always a part of my life. And I remember learning to program a little bit when I was pretty young. One of my brothers taught me BASIC. And when we had the graphing calculators in like middle school and high school math, I would program on those quite a lot. And so I think the logic of programming is something that I'm very easy to work with, which strangely, I've never used Max. I've never learned to use Max MSP. I know that's very much the same of, it's a logical, you program it to do things. I've just never had the time to learn and get into that. But probably if it weren't science, then it would be some kind of computer development field because I always loved doing that.
I feel you. My grandfather in like the 70s and the 80s was a programmer for IBM. So
Cool.
I also like inexplicably, we always had a computer in the house, even though we didn't probably need it. And you can see me, Roger, but people listening can't see me. But we had like the big, like giant floppy disks that were
Yep. I had so many of those.
5 or 6 inches long, not the 3.5 floppy.
The 5.5 or 5 1/4.
Exactly.
Whatever it
And
was.
so, yeah, I think I'm kind of with you on that. Like I've also thought about what would my answer be to this question, because I ask everybody this question, and I think computers stuff has always it's been so intuitive in my life, or my intuition regarding computers has always kind of been there, I think, because of that. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I like puzzles. That's something like if I'm ever unwinding, I'm either going running or I'm doing some kind of puzzle like thing, and not like jigsaw puzzle. I'm meaning like logic puzzles. So that really ties into my all the use of computers that I had in the programming, and I think my mind just does that. And I think my mind solves puzzles for composition too. I love Bach. I love how the counterpoint that he's able to spin, is this amazing intellectual thing, but also creates an emotional response when you hear it. And so that kind of puzzling together notes and rhythms, I think, is a really amazing thing that I love to do with music. And it ties into just like when I'm wasting 10 minutes and putting a color puzzle together. My mind enjoys that.
For sure. Yeah. Is there a tool that you use in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from?
I don't know how long I've been doing this consciously, but this is part of my creative process that has helped me a lot. So most composers, and I see this a lot in my students, you hit writer's block every now and then, and you just get to a wall, and it's like, I don't know what to write next.
Of course.
And
Yeah.
then maybe you're there for months, or maybe you're there for not months, but it feels so painful when you get to that point. And I haven't really experienced that very often, but I found a really good strategy that I employ all the time that has worked so that I avoid it. And I really haven't had writer's block in a long time because of this. So, just to get my juices flowing every time I'm composing, when I'm finishing a session, I don't write the last thing that I know I want to write. So
Oh,
I
okay.
leave my process half finished. I'm in the middle of an idea, and I know how that idea is going to keep on going, and I have that vision in my mind of what am I going to do next. But I refuse to write it down, because if I write it down, then I might reach the end of something and not know the next note. So I leave that unwritten, and then the next time I go to compose, we're all busy. Maybe it's the next day, maybe it's 10 days later. I remember that thing that I already was planning on writing, and then I'm immediately right back in the process, and I'm able to create a lot of new stuff and never get stuck because of that. So I think I'm always looking ahead. That goal orientation, that's a pillar of my process. Oftentimes I'll think of the climax of the piece first, and then I will choose not to write it ever until I get to that. I usually compose from the beginning to the end sequentially. Sometimes that breaks up, but usually my process is to figure out, okay, what is the point of this piece? What is that moment that everyone's going to be waiting for at towards the end of the piece? And then I'm going to work my way towards that, but I'm not going to let myself write that climax down until I've earned my way to that moment in the music. And then it's going to be so gratifying when I finally get to that point and I can write down this thing I've been envisioning in my mind this whole time. And it means that I'm always working towards something, so I don't really get stuck along the way. I have this idea in mind that I'm just restraint, I'm holding back. And that's worked really well to help me first not have writer's block, but also write cohesive music
Sure.
that
Yeah.
I think has a focus the whole way through. It's really helped with that.
Oh man, yeah. I mean, for me personally, like so much of my compositional process like rattles around in my head before I have a chance to like actually sit down and do it, like what you're talking about. So I think I'm gonna have to steal that, or maybe I'm already doing it. Now I'm just gonna think about
Yeah,
that.
you might be doing like some of it subconsciously, but I think consciously doing it has really helped me just like to control the process and trust that the next time I sit down to compose, I'm able to produce something, and that it's going to be, I know it's going to be something that I've already wanted to write. So it's going to be something that works for me. Even if I end up changing it, like you'll do that, you'll go backwards every now and then and change everything that you've written. That's part of the process. That's a hard part of the process that I found every now and then I'll like bark up the wrong tree with something and write many minutes of music that just don't work and not realize it until I've already written all of that music and spent months doing it. But then sometimes I'll just have to go back and start over. And usually I'm much faster at writing the right thing after I've done that. So usually it pays off.
Oh, it's brilliant. So my final question for you is, what is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
I think that ties to what I've been doing with writing for young people as well as writing for professionals. And I feel like sometimes I'm putting on many hats. Like when you're writing a piece for beginning band students, You'll write something that sounds like one thing, and when you write a piece for the Sinta Quartet, it's probably going to sound very different because you're able to do more musical things, more rhythms, more pitches, all sorts of things that you can't put in front of sixth graders and expect them to achieve. But I feel like that all comes from a place deep within me that is honest to who I am as a composer. And I always strive to make the best possible music, no matter what the constraints are of that music, whether I'm choosing them or not. And I think that that's so important to me. I always think like we emphasize so much in composition teaching of finding your voice and working your way towards finding that compositional voice that's uniquely yours. And if you listen to a lot of my compositions, one after another, you'll find lots of different styles. You'll find lots of different sounding pieces. You'll find some that use completely different techniques than others. And so, do I even have a voice? And I think my voice isn't defined by the style of music that I'm using, because that changes every day. And it's like a chameleon. It's one day I need to write this style of music for something, and this other day I feel like a different style.
Right.
But it's defined by something else. And it's defined by some of these other less tangible elements that maybe you don't notice if you analyze my music in a more traditional way. So I hope that's something that people can know about my music, that, even a piece that seems simple might not come from a place that is simple. It might still be coming from a place that is, rich with musical direction and intention.
Oh, I think that's such a lovely way to end this conversation. Thank you for that. Roger, it's always great to sit down and talk to you. I hope we get to do it again soon. And just thanks so much for spending time with me today. It's been the crash course on science stuff was really great. So thank you.
Yeah, this was awesome. Thanks so much. I love doing this.
I am becoming increasingly aware through all of these conversations that I'm doing that our role as composers and artists must be to distill really complex or niche interests into a consumable format to spread the good word to audiences through music. And I think Roger does that so well and is just a perfect example of taking some really intense ideas and issues in our world and existence and turning it into just really amazing music. Definitely check out more of Roger's work on his website. It's at rogerzare.com, and I'll share a link to that in the show notes for this episode. I'm Tyler Kline, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. We are online at looseleaftransmissions.com, where you can find more episodes of the podcast, as well as ways to support the podcast and network. All right, folks, that'll do it for this episode. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you here next time for the next edition of Music Maker.